All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, well, our topic today is zoonotic diseases, keeping your whole family healthy. And so today we're going to be talking about a couple of things that you could potentially catch from your pets. The first is going to be Toxocara canis, which is a worm, ringworm, which is actually a fungus, rabies, is a virus, and toxoplasma, which is a coccidial parasite. So just so we're all on the same page, a zoonotic disease is a disease that has its natural reservoir in an animal species but can be passed on to humans. So our first parasite here is going to be Toxocara canis, which is the canine roundworm. The adult worm produces eggs which are found in the feces of the infected animal, and these are Toxocara canis eggs. The larvae develop inside the eggs out in the environment, and once they become larvated this way, these are now infected once they are ingested. So the eggs hatch in the intestine of the animal who has just eaten these, and then they begin a migration. And nobody's really sure why they do this migration, but it is part of the basis for some of their modes of transmission that we're going to talk about a little bit later. So they actually migrate through veins to the liver and then through further veins up through the heart and into the lungs. And they are maturing during all of this time. They're coughed up from the lungs, swallowed back into the intestines, where they become adults and start to lay eggs and start this whole process all over again. These are adult roundworms here. Now, while they're doing all of this migrating, they can actually become sequestered in various tissues throughout the body. Well, once they've become sequestered, they're inactivated for an indefinite period of time. And one of the things that can reactivate these larvae is hormone changes, such as occur with pregnancy in female animals. And so this can allow larvae to actually be transmitted to puppies while still in the uterus, in addition to having larvae actually shed in the milk. So because of all of these modes of transmission, puppies can end up with huge numbers of these ascarid worms. They have them in their system before they're ever born. During the first couple of days while they're nursing, they're getting more larvae from their mothers. And if they're in a dirty environment, they're picking up eggs in addition. So puppies can end up with huge, huge numbers of these roundworms. And some of the clinical signs that we can see, and they are very varied. It can be anything from just a pot-bellied, just fat, roly-poly little puppy, to vomiting and diarrhea, and they may actually vomit up worms. You may see worms in the diarrhea, or you may not see anything at all. They can have a very rough hair coat because the worms are stealing all of their nutrition. They're just not getting fed like they should. They can be anemic from blood loss. They can end up with pneumonia because, remember, the worms are going through those lungs. The worms produce toxic secretions, so they can get sick from those. If you have large enough numbers, you can actually rupture the bile or pancreatic ducts, and puppies can actually die from these infections. Now, in people get those worms basically some of the same ways that puppies do, if you are ingesting worms or eggs from the environment. And the primary diseases that we see in people are ocular larval migrans and visceral larval migrans. So a human being eats these larvated eggs just like a dog would. The eggs hatch in the intestine, and they set about the migration. Well, basically, while they're migrating, they're looking for a dog. And since we're not a dog, they tend to get lost. And when they die in various and assorted tissues and set up a huge inflammatory response. And so most infections are going to occur in young children, 3 to 5 years old. As you can guess, this is the age group that has the worst hygiene. They're most likely to be out in the sandbox, eating dirt, playing with things that they're not supposed to, and not washing their hands afterwards. And the most common place for a larva to actually end up in children is in the retina of the eye. They can end up in other organ systems as well, and so symptoms can be anything from fever, asthma, pneumonia, an enlarged liver, but the biggest thing we actually see are retinal lesions. So when these larvae end up in the eye, they can cause partial or complete blindness. But another thing that tends to be a little bit frightening is these retinal lesions tend to be very similar to a cancer that is seen. And the cancer is called retinoblastoma, and it is a very invasive and malignant cancer. So if your ophthalmologist thinks that this is what your child has, they're going to recommend they actually remove that eye to stop the spread of the cancer. Then when they find out on histopathology it was actually a worm, people tend to be very, very upset about that for very good reasons. So this is a worm right there in a liver tissue sample here, and this is the retinal lesions. This is the optic disc, which is normal with all of the blood vessels coming off, and then this is actually a worm embedded in the retina. So the best way to keep everyone in your family safe is routine deworming of all pets, but especially young puppies. Because all puppies are assumed infected with roundworms until proven otherwise. And so we like to do our first deworming at 4 weeks. Then we do another one between 6 to 8 weeks of age, about 12 weeks, and at about 6 months. And then we deworm adult animals every 6 months unless they're known to be in an area that has a very high environmental infestation and we know that they're being infected more often, then we're going to deworm them more often. So this routine deworming significantly decreases the number of eggs that are shed into the environment, and fewer eggs in the environment mean fewer eggs for you or your children to come in contact with. Again, good hygiene is going to be very, very important. Wash your hands after coming in contact with feces or anything contaminated with feces. Teach children not to eat dirt or sand, and to wash their hands after playing in these kinds of areas. And again, just because your pets are taken care of doesn't mean that everybody else's are. So be careful in public parks, especially sandboxes. You have no idea what kind of animals have been through those areas. Enforce leash laws in parks to keep animals out of the sandboxes in areas where children play. And again, don't let nursing puppies lick you or your children's faces. Remember, there are infective larvae in that milk. So if they've got milk on their faces and they're up licking your face, you can potentially catch the worms that way as well. So in summary, for Toxocara, it is a very common parasite. There are many modes of transmission, and there are potentially dire consequences to both people and their pets. But it's very easy to control with routine deworming and good hygiene with you and your family. So next, we are going to talk about ringworm. And clinically, we know this is dermatophytosis, and it's actually caused by a fungus. And there's actually several different species of fungus that can cause clinical signs in both people and pets. So Microsporum canis is one of the more common ones. We see it in dogs and cats actually quite a bit. And then this trichophyton is seen more in rodents, but it can be seen in cats and dogs as well. So depending on the species is going to vary a little bit on where you're going to find these organisms. So they can be found in soil, or they may be associated with the shed skin or hair cells from infected animals. And these particles can remain infective in the environment for long periods of time. And this is actually a picture of what these organisms look like under the microscope. And so infection can occur in both humans and animals from direct contact with either an infected animal or from infective particles in the environment. And different individuals have different susceptibilities to infection. So some people can have animals that have ringworm, they sleep in the same bed with them, they're in constant contact with them and never get it. Some people look at a dog with ringworm and it seems like they're going to catch it. So it just really varies a lot. Kids do seem to be a bit more susceptible, especially to the M. canis, and trichophyton is more infectious to people of any age. So these are some kitties with ringworm. So we've got the lesions here, and on this, the nose right here. But pets can actually develop lesions anywhere on their bodies, and they tend to be sort of circular with a leading edge that's going to be reddish and crusty. And some animals actually have very extensive infections. They can have basically just be a big ball of ringworm. We do see that sometimes. They just kind of have lesions all over their bodies. Sometimes it's very localized, like these guys, 1 or 2 spots. And lesions in people do seem to be similar to those in pets. And the location in people tends to be a little bit more limited because you have to come in direct contact, usually with your infected animal. And so legs, arms, faces, necks tend to be the most common places. So these are ringworm lesions. This is a fairly extensive infection here. poor person has them all over. And so the way we treat ringworm depends a little bit on the severity of the case. If it's 1 or 2 spots, otherwise healthy animal, there are topical preparations. You just put it on there and basically you're good to go. It does take a while to resolve, so if you or your animals have ringworm, you're looking at 2 to 4 weeks worth of treatment. But generalized cases, some of these animals that have it everywhere, we do have to do oral medications, and so we do oral antifungals. And the 2 that we use most commonly are griseofulvin or ketoconazole. So you're not going to be able to prevent environmental infestations, unfortunately, but they're not all that common. But ringworm can be passed from person to person. It can be passed from person to pet, as well as pet to person. So just because you have ringworm doesn't necessarily mean that your pet had ringworm first, and you may actually give it to your pet if it didn't have it first. If it is only your pet that is the only one in the family with ringworm, wash your hands very carefully. And remember to wash your face and neck as well as your arms and legs. Most people are really good about washing their hands, but they forgot that they picked up the cat and rubbed it all over their neck. So we have infections that are coming from the environment as well as animal to animal. Again, just because you have it doesn't mean your pet had it. So we do get people coming in, my kid has ringworm, find it on the dog. We may not find it on the dog, so just something to be aware of. And if your pet is infected, good hygiene is going to be the #1 way to keep from spreading it around. Right, so moving on, we're now going to talk about a virus, and rabies is going to be the virus we're going to talk about. This is actually a photomicrograph picture of the rabies virus. It is in the family Rhabdoviridae, and the genus Lyssavirus. It is a single-stranded virus, and it is RNA-based. Now, most viruses are very host-specific, meaning if one species has it, usually they are not going to pass to other species. Rabies is one of the exceptions to that rule, and it actually can infect any mammal, but some species are more susceptible than others. So in general, rabies is maintained in nature by bats, skunks, raccoons, foxes, coyotes, and some other species as well. But these are going to be our most common ones here. In general, the saliva of an infected animal contains very, very large amounts of virus. And so bite wounds are going to be the #1 way that rabies is going to be spread around. There have been very rare instances where people have been infected by aerosol, which is mostly going to happen if you've got open wounds or you're in like a bat cave, something with a lot of virus around, and it can actually get in through mucous membranes. This is very uncommon. A few people have been infected in necropsy trying to get the brain out of an infected animal so that they can test it. Again, it's very, very uncommon. Bite wounds are #1. So after an animal bites you, the virus begins to replicate in the local muscle tissues. Eventually, it's going to gain access to the motor nerve endings, and it's going to start slowly moving up the peripheral nerves toward the spinal cord and eventually the brain. Now, upon reaching the spinal cord, the virus begins replicating again rapidly and then spreads very quickly through the brain and the rest of the central nervous system. It can cause a variety of clinical signs, including cranial nerve deficits, lameness, behavior changes, and then the virus moves actually down those cranial nerves, and that's how it's going to end up in the salivary glands. So the incubation period is going to be the time from exposure until the animal or person starts showing clinical signs. And this time frame is very highly variable with rabies. We don't really understand what controls the rate of spread from the site of infection up to the brain. Certainly the severity of the bite and the location of the bite play a role, but some people there have been up to 2 years between the bite and the actual clinical signs in people. So it can be a very long time, and we really have no idea how long it takes for wild species. And that's part of how it's maintained in nature, because they can be infected for a very long period of time. So the severity of the bite plays a role. A more severe bite is going to have more saliva in it. So more saliva means more virus, so you have a higher load. And certainly a bite on the leg is going to be much further from the brain than a bite on the face or neck. So again, clinical signs are very varied. We can have animals that are very aggressive, which is kind of our classic. Everybody thinks Old Yeller, but they can be actually very passive. You see wild animals that are friendlier than normal. You want to be a little careful. They may actually be rabid. They may be pacing, trembling, salivating. They may be paralyzed, withdraw from the world. They may just be lame. So basically, any neurologic signs, you want to have rabies kind of in the back of your mind because it can cause pretty much anything. And unfortunately, the only way to 100% confirm a rabies infection is postmortem. So we actually have to send the brain off to a diagnostic lab to find out for sure. So the chances of being infected from a bite on the arm or leg with no treatment is 30 to 40%. The chances of being infected from a bite on the face or neck is 60 to up to 100%. And the chances of actually dying once you contract rabies and have clinical signs is 99%. So in the US, human exposure is most likely to be from raccoons, bats, and cats. Raccoons and bats are the wild species that most often come in contact with humans, so they're most likely to spread things along. Cats are much less likely than dogs to be properly vaccinated for rabies, and they are less likely to be confined at night, so they have more exposure to wildlife. So a cat poses a greater risk than a dog in the US. In other parts of the world, it's going to be just the opposite because there are so many wild dogs that are not vaccinated that rabies is actually still a big problem in many other countries. So if you are bitten, you or your pets, the first thing to do is wash thoroughly with soap and water for 5 to 10 minutes or as long as you can stand it. This is going to decrease the local viral load. The less virus that you have locally, the less chance it has to replicate and start spreading. If a person is bitten by a domestic species, you basically have two options. One, you can euthanize whoever bit you and have it tested immediately for rabies. This usually takes 1 to 2 days. So if it comes back positive, you've got plenty of time to start treatment. Sometimes if this is somebody's pet who has bit you, they're not going to be very happy about this euthanasia. So your other option is to quarantine the animal for 10 days. The reason for this is because we're going to start shedding in the saliva no more than 10 days before they start showing clinical signs. So if an animal bites you and 10 days later it's still normal, there's no clinical signs, it's still acting happy and just like it always did, there was no rabies virus in that saliva, there's no chance you could be infected, so you don't have to worry about doing the whole 5 shots and prophylactic immunization. So, but if you find out that you were bitten by a rabid animal, then you will have to get your shots. And there are 5 vaccinations, and it's over a 28-day period. And so you get vaccines on day 1, day 3, day 7, day 14, and day 28. And it is actually in the arm now. I know that once upon a time you used to get these vaccines in the stomach, and a lot of people still think that that's the way it is. So fortunately, it's not, and so that's not too bad anymore. So as far as your pets go, if your pet is unvaccinated and it gets bit by a wild animal, you can just euthanize if you don't want to take the risks, but you don't necessarily have to send the animal in for testing if there was no human exposure to the virus. Or we can quarantine the animal, strict quarantine for 6 months, and then we vaccinate the pet 1 month before release. Remember we were talking about the very long period, the incubation period for rabies? That's why this is 6 months. And even that may not be 100% effective, but it's going to catch most cases. But if your pet was vaccinated and it was bitten, we revaccinate, they're allowed to go home with the owner. We try to limit access to other pets and people for 45 days, just in case, but these pets tend to be much, much safer than animals who are unvaccinated. And so prevention is vaccination. Vaccines are safe, and they are a very, very effective way of protecting pets and people. So as long as your pets are well vaccinated, your dogs and your cats, you're going to be in pretty good shape. So again, this is a fatal disease, and it is in pets and people. It is still present in all states in the US, but it is fairly easily prevented with vaccination and minimizing your contact with wild species. So our final, yes?
I have a question. What are the clinical signs in humans?
They're going to be similar, and they tend to be just as vague, unfortunately. But in general, in people, if there is any thought that that they were bitten by a rabid animal, they start with the vaccines. And as long as those vaccines are started in a reasonable period of time, you're going to be protected.
Now, this is also a technical question. If your pet is bitten and you have to quarantine it for 6 months, can you do it on your own, or do you have to put it in a
They do want those animals to be in either a boarding facility or with a veterinarian for those 6 months. So that's why a lot of people don't do it. It gets very, very expensive trying to keep an animal quarantined for that period of time. Okay. So our last topic here is Toxoplasma. It is a coccidial parasite, and it is an obligate intracellular organism, which means that it has to be inside a cell to survive, and it does not live very long in the environment outside of an animal. The cat is the definitive host, but it can actually infect any warm-blooded species. So the oocysts are passed in the feces. This is an oocyst. They sporulate in the environment over a period of 1 to 5 days, and only the sporulated oocyst is going to be infectious to other animals. So if another cat gets a hold of this sporulated oocyst, then the intestines are colonized with the organism. The oocyst develops into gametes and then gametocytes, and then the gametocytes are going to come together to form a zygote, which develops into a new oocyst to be shed into the environment. So this is the sexual cycle for Toxoplasma. This cycle only occurs in felines. And so a normal cat will go through this cycle once in its lifetime, shed the organism, and then it's going to be immune. Now, if another species happens to get a hold of one of these oocysts, then something different happens, and the oocysts will form tissue cysts instead. So if an animal with a tissue cyst is eaten, then the cysts are reactivated in whatever ate them, and they are going to infect the new animal. If that animal is a cat, then within 3 to 7 days, they're going to start shedding oocyst in their feces. If a cat eats an oocyst, it takes much longer, 18 to 44 days, before they will actually start shedding. And cats typically are going to become infected by either ingesting oocysts or by eating the tissue cysts. The biggest places that they're going to get these tissue cysts are from hunting. So various rodents out in the wild are going to be infected. And raw meat is actually going to be a big issue as well. So humans can become infected with the Toxoplasma, and it can be from eating oocysts found in cat feces. But this is actually a pretty uncommon way for people to become infected. It's much more common for people to get these from eating undercooked pork products, beef as well, but primarily pork products. And so with kitties, typically they have either no clinical signs or very mild clinical signs, diarrhea, that kind of thing, because it is an intestinal parasite in cats. But when they develop tissue cysts, it can be related to any body system. Heart, liver, lungs, pancreas, anything can be infected. And humans, because we get the tissue cysts as well, can also have a very large variety of clinical signs. Anything from fever and chills, a rash, enlarged lymph nodes, to meningitis, encephalitis, if these things are in the brain. And the one that most people know of and are very worried about are the abortion and congenital defects, which is why pregnant women are told not to play with the litter box to avoid cats, those kinds of things. Now, if you have tissue cysts and they're not causing you a problem and you become immunocompromised for any reason, then these tissue cysts can reactivate. And typically when that happens, encephalitis is going to be the #1 thing that occurs in people as well as in pets. So to control this, keep your cats inside, do not allow them to hunt, and never feed them raw meat. And as far as humans go, to keep yourself safe, clean the litter box daily, because those oocysts take 24 hours to become infective. So if you clean it every day, they're never going to be infective when you're cleaning. Certainly keep wearing gloves. Good hygiene afterwards is also going to be important. Keep your cats away from any food preparation areas, so off the counters, away from the table, things like that. And do not consume undercooked pork products, as that is the #1 way people become infected in the US. So again, it is a relatively common disease. It can be contracted from pets, but other sources are actually going to be more dangerous. And there are a variety of clinical signs, so it can be difficult to diagnose, but it is fairly easily prevented with some simple steps. So, any questions on anything we talked about today? I know we covered a lot of material.